To Sahiba Gill's presentation. Sahiba is the Deputy Legal Director at Global Labor Justice, and she will present her chapter titled Human Supply Chain as Global Value Chain, Employer Control in Nepal, GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, Low Wage Labor Recruitment. The floor is yours. Where is Sahiba?
I'm here. Thank you, Tamar. Thank you so much to Hila and Tamar for the invitation to be here and spend time with you all today. It's wonderful to see you all virtually and celebrate this book and the years of work that went into it from the editors. As Tamar said, I'm going to present my book chapter, which is titled Human Supply Chain as Global Value Chain, Employer Control in Nepal, GCC, Low Wage Labor Recruitment. The chapter covers empirical qualitative research that I did several years ago through the lens of global value chains, examining recruitment of low-wage workers from Nepal to the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC. And I should say that today I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not in my role at GLJ. So I'll start from the beginning. The recruitment of low-wage workers was first theorized as a global value chain per se by Professor Jennifer Gordon, who developed the concept of the human supply chain, which posits an analogy between product supply chains and labor recruitment, where employers act as lead firms and recruiters, the companies that recruit migrant workers from one country for employers in another, as suppliers. The human supply chain model, in that model, employers cause labor abuses in recruitment, such as extortionate fees, misinformation, and coercion, through their power down the human supply chain over the recruiters they employ. Now, the human supply chain model builds on the literature on global value chains, which is literature that is theoretical and is also deeply grounded in empirical research about product supply chains and the relationships among actors in them. And while there is extensive empirical research on product supply chains, there is no similar empirical research on human supply chains as such, as a global value chain. So I wrote the chapter that I'm going to talk about today to really fill that gap. Having empirical research on human supply chains helps us understand how law and market relations play a role in constructing these human supply chains and in producing outcomes, including of recruitment abuses. It can show exactly how employer control over recruitment happens, including through contracts and through penalties, and exactly how it leads to results like recruitment abuses that we want to prevent. The book chapter is rooted in a case study, the Nepal to GCC migration corridor, and it's based on interviews with 43 labor recruiters in Nepal. The year I did the research, 2 million Nepali male workers migrated to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait for construction and similar low-wage work. And almost all foreign employment happened and continues to happen through recruiters. The important role of these recruiters has really led to their proliferation in Nepal and other similar migrant sending countries. And at the time of my research, there were over 900 officially registered recruiters operating in Nepal. These agencies sent anywhere from 300 to 4,000 workers abroad yearly, and they themselves work with a whole network of unlicensed individual agents who have connections with workers in rural villages, which helps them hire at scale. So, as I mentioned before, recruiters offer their recruitment services to employers in the GCC who want to hire Nepali workers. The recruiters provide the service of hiring the workers, often through the sub-agents that I just mentioned. And then after that, the employer in the GCC secures their visas. And then the work goes back on the recruiters to finish the job. So the recruiters coordinate the rest of the immigration for the GCC employer. the contract signing, approvals from the Nepal government, purchasing of plane tickets, even getting workers on the plane, the last mile of delivery in the human supply chain. So that was the process that I was studying when I was asking recruiters questions during the research. So in this book chapter, I asked two research questions about the human supply chain as a global value chain. The first is literally, to what extent does a human supply chain reflect the key elements of a buyer-driven supply chain, as outlined in the GVC literature, where buyers, here buyers of labor or employers, are controlling the process? The second is, if that employer control is present, can we really show that it plays a role in the recruitment abuses that we know contribute to forced labor? And in particular, what role does that employer control play? So, with those questions in mind, I'll tell you what I found. So, my first major finding confirms that human supply chains from Nepal to the GCC really exhibit four characteristics of buyer-driven value chains. First, there's a clear bargaining power imbalance between the recruiters in Nepal and the employers in the GCC. So, recruiters consistently reported that their services were engaged through very competitive bidding processes, with the employers in the GCC soliciting multiple bids from potential recruiters and threatening to find lower bids if the recruiters didn't accept their terms. Recruiters attributed this to unhealthy competition. That was the quote, the phrase that they often used, stemming from low entry barriers, which is a phenomenon that's very similar to, for example, the garment industry in a lot of Asia. Low barriers to entry into the market, leading to a proliferation of agencies. And this, in particular, rapidly happened following Nepal's civil war, where there was a particular demand for outward migration. As one recruiter stated, you would go bankrupt, that's the quote, if you didn't accept the employer's terms. Interestingly, it is worth noting that there is a small minority of recruiters with other sources of financial stability in their business who could maintain minimum standards requiring employers to cover costs or follow the employer pays principle, which is the ILO standard for fair recruitment. But these were really exceptions, working with a small and rare clientele in the GCC and not the norm. So the second characteristic of a buyer-driven value chain that I found in this human supply chain was enforceable contracts with penalties. So most recruiters reported that the negotiations that they had with GCC employers resulted in verbal or email agreements that I would consider to be legally enforceable. And critically, they really reported that the GCC employers were enforcing those contracts through a structure of penalties. Employers would impose significant penalties for non-compliance of the recruiter with the agreed terms of recruitment. And those penalties were varied. They included loss of future business, loss of a security deposit that the recruiter had paid to the employer, partial or just non-payment of the agreed fee for services that had already been provided. And finally, forcing the recruiters to pay for worker repatriation if a worker needed to be repatriated because they had not been recruited in compliance with the agreed terms, usually involving a legal violation. So the third aspect of a global value chain that I found in this human supply chain is that there were many employer-imposed contract terms, and I'll go over them. So the first, most obvious one, perhaps, is cost. Employers use their bargaining power to minimize their own costs on labor, often, and not only on labor, but also on recruitment. So they often paid nothing for recruitment or even solicited bribes for the benefit of their business. So they would actually gain money through the recruitment process. Few employers really covered all recruitment costs. Another is volume. So employers required large crews delivered simultaneously. For example, 50 carpenters who were going to be sent on the same flight. And that really necessitated the use of the agent networks that I mentioned before. In addition, employers had tight timelines. So employers typically demanded worker delivery to them as the employer within 10 or 16 days, which recruiters deemed barely feasible. It's akin to just-in-time production, but here we have just-in-time production of people. Some recruiters disclosed actually violating Nepali law to meet deadlines, including bribing officials to get paperwork done especially quickly. Plus, one of the key that's I particularly notable because the additional employer imposed contract term that employers insisted on was legal compliance. So employers demanded that there be proper paperwork showing that all of the recruitment had been done in compliance with national law, while remaining conveniently willfully ignorant about the accuracy of that paperwork. They wanted documentation showing that their fees that the worker had paid had only met the legal cap and not gone beyond it. And they did not want to verify, for example, the actual amount that workers were paying. And finally, the final term that employers imposed was worker preparedness. So workers really had to be ready to begin a job immediately upon arrival. Employers wanted that the worker have a proper understanding of the job and destination, and that there not be a conflict about the terms of the work once the worker arrived in the destination country. So those are the employer imposed contract terms. And the final feature of a GVC that I found in the human supply chain is that these contract terms are hard to achieve. If we think that it's hard to produce or deliver products in a product supply chain, there is even more complication in a human supply chain that has to be dealt with and ultimately often results in harms to workers. So I show in the paper how employer penalties for non-performance by recruiters of agreed terms um, are designed to actually make sure that the recruiters deliver on the contract terms that the employers want. In the paper, I highlight the particular role that penalties play in maintaining employer advantage and control over the recruitment process in situations where, without such penalties, recruiters would actually have the upper hand in the process. And that is a teaser to read the chapter more in full. So I'll move to my findings on the second research question, which was really how does this whole process that I just laid out actually impact workers? So my second finding really demonstrates how these employer-imposed contract terms contribute to recruitment abuses, both directly and indirectly. So the empirical research I've done confirms several effects, some of which I think have really become common knowledge, but others I think are new. So the first and now widely accepted is that when employers don't pay for recruitment, recruiters pass the costs on to workers, resulting in recruitment fees. The second, and also well known, is that employers operate in the context of regulation in workers' origin countries, but they don't pay for the cost of compliance. And that really leads recruiters to falsify records. As I mentioned before, for example, showing the government that a worker only paid $300 in recruitment fees when in fact they paid $3,000. The third is a bit newer. It's about speed, that need for just-in-time production in human supply chains. When employers recruit on compressed deadlines, recruiters are more likely to use informal agents to reach workers faster. And that is a key source of additional recruitment fees as well as information to workers as well. And fourth and finally, there are sunk costs in recruitment that employers are not willing to let go or accept if, at a very late stage of recruitment, workers want to decline work because they discover that they were misinformed. So our general assumption about coercion in that context is that workers are often already in debt by the time they see a formal contract and are signing it. And so they're already in a situation of coercion. Or even if they're not in debt, they've certainly paid a hefty recruitment fee that has wiped out their capital. And that is very much true. But it is also true that employers are not willing to accept the sunk costs that they've already spent for recruitment at that stage. For example, the cost of a visa or the plane tickets. And instead, they just push this onto recruiters and in turn onto the workers. So, as a means of conclusion, I really found it fascinating and enlightening to conduct this granular research. And I also think it's important to our response to forced labor of low-wage migrant workers because it shows how, at the individual level of a supplier, the proverbial bad actors recruit. The proverbial bad actor, rather, recruiters, make choices about fees charged to workers and fraud and coercion of workers not because they are unethical or bad actors per se, but because they are operating in a system of contract-based incentives that are set up by employers. And that's the same dynamic we see in product supply chains around the world, and that we treat as structural in that context. The real problem is an entire low-wage market of employers in the GCC who are able to take advantage of no domestic and no transnational regulation to really maximize their own profits at the expense of some of the poorest workers in the world. And I think incidentally, this was well illustrated by the statistic that Franz mentioned that when Top Glove in Malaysia reimbursed workers for recruitment fees, the total was 30 million. These are really significant transfers of wealth from workers to corporations. So it's my goal here that the empirical research provides additional support for a model of structural regulation of supply chains, regulating employers, because regulating employers at the top of supply chains is really the only truly effective means of regulating recruitment of visas. Thank you.
Thank